So good morning. Hey, come on, this is a KDD event. You know how to say good morning. Try it, come on. That still wasn't very good. Once more for the camera, you're on record here. Come on, say good morning. Good morning. There you go, now that's well done. So I want to start in an unusual way. Since I'm not going to spend as much time on algorithms, I'm going to spend more time about why algorithms and data science usually doesn't take root inside large companies as fast as we expect. I want to give you a little bit of a cultural background beyond the 13 people in my high school graduating class. I'm sort of a strange mix, personally, a little bit of a right brain thinker and a little bit of a left brain thinker. Since they're not here to defend themselves, I'm going to blame my parents. My dad, if you met him, is highly analytical. He's got a PhD in chemical engineering, very structured, very Germanic. On the other hand, my mom is much more of a creative type, kind of artsy. She got her degree in history. If you met her, you would instantly recognize her as quite French. So like most of you, I think, in the room, I'm a little bit of both. A little bit of my mom and a little bit of my dad. Now, before I got into data science as a discipline, early in my life, I made most of my decisions based on my intuition, based on my gut. And I was in grad school, getting a PhD in computer science, when my intuition told me to quit without my degree, get in my car, drive cross-country to Silicon Valley, and get my fame and fortune that way. That was what my intuition told me. Well, after playing beach volleyball in Santa Cruz for 2 weeks, the cold hard facts took over. I was starting to run out of money. I was no closer in getting a job. And the reality is that Silicon Valley was 20 miles over the hill from Santa Cruz to maybe Palo Alto. This might be the first time in human record that somebody can't hear me. I have normally a very big voice. Is that any better in the back? Yes? Better? Okay. So having discovered that my intuition was failing me, you think I would have changed how I made decisions. But unfortunately, I didn't. In fact, those first couple of years in Silicon Valley, I still made most of my decisions based on my intuition. I chose not to join Netscape in 1995. I didn't join Yahoo in either 96 or much later in 2003. In fact, around that same time, I was in a rent-to-own situation in Los Gatos, and I walked away from that thinking, real estate's much too expensive. What are the odds that a house in Los Gatos is going to increase its price in 20 years? So somehow my intuition didn't work on the internet, nor did it work on Silicon Valley real estate. I pretty much had a wake-up call. I realized the time was to move from being more like mom to more like dad. So I doubled down on analytics. In 1997, a bunch of us started an analytical company, a data mining company called NeoVista, which focused on the retail space. And to this day, one of my favorite business problems that I've ever been involved on was using a neural net to try to predict daily sales at the store SKU level. Now, Walmart at that time had more than 1,000 stores and more than 10,000 SKUs. So that was a tough business problem to predict what the daily sales was. And we labored in Bentonville, Arkansas at Walmart's headquarters trying to figure out that problem for months until we finally found good lift. But I remember the day I presented my model to the senior executives of Walmart to show them that they could more accurately predict daily sales. And one of the most senior merchandisers looked at me and said, and this is a quote that I'll never forget, said, "I don't care what your brain algorithm says. It's never been to Peoria during Halloween. I know what the sell-through for Skittles will be. I make the decision, not an algorithm." Now, as controversial as that might sound to you, and as stuck in the mud, we did finally get a sale out of Walmart, not nearly as big as we thought, but it pierced my veil that said, no matter how good decisions are, something has got to fundamentally change. And so what happened? From NeoVista, I was continually involved in the KDD community. I got, thank you very much, community, several papers published in cooperation with a couple of colleagues, one that I see sitting here in the front row today. I was still a science guy, despite that experience that culture was winning out, that intuition was winning out. But the year after, in 2007, in fact, I was even invited to be the treasurer of KDD. That was sort of the peak of my involvement in the community. But a year later, something happened. I literally dropped off the KDD earth. only to reappear here roughly 10 years later. And the stories I want to tell you is what I learned about the reality of data science inside of large companies over the last 10 years. So why did I jump off or fall off the K2D earth? The year after I was treasurer, my last startup got acquired by SAP. You heard Osama say, I became the CMO. On paper, I'm the least likely person on the planet to be the CMO of a multinational company with 1,500 employees and $1 billion plus budget. But most of you may know that marketing has been going through a change. It's been changing its mental model from primarily about branding and advertising to also about analytics. For years, there was this great John Wanamaker quote, he of the grandfather of advertising, that people rallied around to explain why data science mattered. Wanamaker allegedly said, there's actually not much proof that he really said this, that I know that half my advertising is wasted, I just don't know what half. So to get the rallying cry internal to the company, I made a fundamental change. I hired a ton of data scientists in roughly 2010. And because it was a popular TV program at the time, my internal rallying cry was, we need to change ourselves from madmen to mathmen. From madmen to mathmen. At least some of you must have seen that TV show because I got a chuckle out of you. The reality is that was a huge culture crash. People didn't want to change. They wanted to spend more time on colors and art palettes than they did wanting on looking at math. And so I did a series of internal education and sometimes external education to explain why gut was not always better than facts. Some of those were only intended for internal use. A lot of them were intended to be humorous. And occasionally I use sports because I love sports and I'm a big sports analytics guy. Now I'm going to show you one now that we used. It never became external. Technically, I'm not allowed to show it to a third-party environment, so even though this is going to be on film, remember, don't tweet this particular one. This is for internal use only, but it'll give you a sense of the change that we needed to go through.
2 on, 2 out, bottom of the ninth.
Do the same thing, bro.
All eyes are on Coach Johnson. His left-handed relief pitcher on the bench. Does he sub him in to close the game?
Obvious! Everybody knows you got to put a southpaw in against the lefty, especially in the ninth.
That southpaw has a 6.32 ERA.
Trust me, they're going to put in the southpaw.
And Reed's getting ready to pitch.
Keeping Reed in?
Left-handers are only hitting 182 against him.
Stats mean nothing in the real world. You got to trust your gut. This coach just threw the game.
Batter is 1 for 18 against Reed. Lifetime.
Reed delivers. It's a tapper back to the mound. Reed throws to first. You were out of there.
Make it 1 for 19.
Here's weird. Well, with a twist.
Know-it-all without being one. The 2011 SAP Baseball Experience. Not just stats, but insight.
Now, it's easy to laugh at that video. We don't really think such people exist that make decisions based on gut. But in fact, that's how most corporations really make the decisions. That's the environment I showed up with. And to be fair, that's really the environment that most of us, at least in large companies, live in today. In case you don't believe me, and I know that's hard to believe at a conference called K2D, dedicated to data science, I'll give you some numbers. In 1997, in the same year we started NeoVista, the data mining company, a consulting firm called Aspec interviewed several thousand senior executives and asked them how do they make decisions. 88% of them admitted they made decisions mostly based on gut. And in fact, when the gut it wasn't the same as the data, they ignored the data. That meant only 12% of the people made decisions mostly based on data. Now, in 2014, more than 15 years later, Economics Intelligent Unit, another consulting company, tried to basically recreate that study. Different people, slightly different questions, but essentially the same study. Now, we're in 2014. As an industry, we have a 30-plus year history of business intelligence, decision support, analytics, neural networks, data science, K2D, et cetera. It hasn't changed. In 2014, 90% of execs admitted to still making decisions largely based on gut. Only 1 in 10 people on an anonymous blind study, executives in large companies, said they mostly made decisions based on data. This is the reality of what we find ourselves in today. And this is why sometimes the best algorithm doesn't get actually used. So I want to talk about my own real-world experience and how, by not just focusing on the data science, we were able to introduce a data culture at a big company, as I called in the title, Teaching the Elephant to Dance. And I want to start in a very unusual place. I want to start with events. Look at this room, it's pretty packed. The one thing I know for sure is that large companies love events. Wait, I got that wrong. Large companies love large events. When executives sit on stages or stand on stages like this one, they love to look out into the audience and see thousands of people there. They love that because the size of the audience to them is an intuition that the company is strong. And if the company is strong, then the health of the company is good. That's their intuition. Now, I know you're probably laughing, but it turns out their intuition's not so bad. We've run a bunch of models, and we can show quite accurately that sitting in a room like this, you're more likely to remember the key facts from a presentation than if you watch that same presentation recorded on the internet later. We also know from models that bringing people to a physical event and interacting with their peers means they are more likely to buy within the next few quarters than pretty much any other marketing tactic that exists. We use these models to do what's called marketing mix modeling to decide how to spend our money. Now, despite that, I'm going to guess that many of you in this room, since we're in the industry track, have been to a large industry event before. Maybe you've been to the ones that are held in the Moscone Center here in San Francisco. If you've been to those events, they don't feel like business events. They have outdoor concerts. Some of them have clowns. They feel like more revivals. And I'll tell you a secret. The companies spend 10 million, 20 million, sometimes more on those events. In fact, for most large companies, they spend more on events, just putting on events, than they do on data science itself. Now, when I was CMO a few years ago, I was faced with this issue. Our largest event is held in Orlando, Florida. That event has more than 20,000 people. But we have 20 other events that were larger than 1,000 people, and every year they grew. In fact, two events in particular, the one in Madrid and the one in Beijing, got very large very quickly. At one point, the Beijing event had 25,000 people in it, and it claimed, we're a satellite event, but we're bigger than the parent event. It became a competition. Now, with a fixed budget, I wondered whether that was the right use of funds. The bigger the event, the more expensive it was, and I tried to convince the executives, the local ones, that having a smaller event was better. Now, you know that probably didn't work. Big event, big company, strong brand, etc. And they said no. And I said, well, what about the business impact? What about sales? And they're like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. Can you get 90% of our customer base, our pipeline, to these events? And that culturally is your opening. Because the minute somebody throws out a number, you have a chance to now argue based on numbers rather than based on gut. So I did what some of you might have done. I created a whale curve, which said, let's look at the pipeline. The first 1,000 customers represent 54% of the pipeline. If you double from 1,000 customers to 2,000 customers, you only get 68% of the pipeline. If you really want 90% of the pipeline there, you have to invite more than 6,000 customers. Now we know, again, from another model, which I won't go into the detail, that the perfect thing is to invite 3 or 4 people from each customer. Less than that, you can't get a decision made. More than that, too many different opinions. So let's just use 3.5 as the average number of people per company. That means at 54%, we're talking about 3,500 people at an event. But at 90% of the pipeline, we're talking about a 21,000 customer event. Do we really need 21,000 people plus employees at an event as well? You can also look what they're interested in. That's the graph on the right. And see that a few topics are highly concentrated based on the size of the deal. So based on this, being a data scientist, I went back to my colleagues and said, at 1/4 the size of the event, with 1/3 of the budget, we can have 70% of the impact. Very logical. Who wouldn't decide to do something for 1/3 the cost, 1/4 the audience, and 70% of the audience? Guess what? The votes were 10-1 against. I voted to do it, of course. I guess I didn't have to say that, but there you go. So what was the problem? There still wasn't a way to influence the 20,000+ people. And we know by doing it over the web isn't going to have as much influence. So solving that problem turned out to mean taking a different approach. In fact, we knew from yet another model, we build a lot of models for events, that there's an inverse correlation to the seniority of a person at an event and how far they have to travel, particularly in Europe and Asia, less so in the US. In other words, the most senior people are willing to travel the least. You have to come to them rather than come to you. So I proposed doing 300 events rather than a few large events. Each of those 300 events were relatively small, 100 to 500 people, but collectively touched more than 100,000. And altogether, we still spent less than half the original money. That changed people's perception and allowed me to go forward with one important cultural caveat. I changed the name of the event. If I'd still called it Sapphire, the mental image would have been big, a large audience. Instead, we changed it to Select, to say that a select few, much like a bouncer at a nightclub were allowed in, changed the expectations of not just our executives, but our customers. Now, I know this is a lot more than you ever expected to learn about events at a data science conference, but in the language of late night infomercials, but wait, there's more. Because it turns out we don't just use models to decide who should go to an event and where they should be staged and how big they are. We use models to decide what topics should be presented at events. Not the topics that the executives want to talk about, but the topics that are most likely to cause people to buy. Not who screams the loudest, which is how decisions are often made at big companies, but which ones have the largest impact on the pipeline. We do the same thing to even decide how to lay out an event. This is a common layout circa 2013, using data from mobile devices and wireless in countries where we're allowed to do that, European privacy laws notwithstanding. We're actually able to show hotspots of where having too many people in one location, like apparently we have in this particular conference room, changes the NPS of an event and therefore reduces the likelihood that people will buy. And we can, sometimes on the fly, but almost always to the next event, change as we go. Today, 6 years later, we have somewhere close to 50 models that are run for more than 1,000 events worldwide. They predict all kinds of things, but not everything. This year in Orlando, they missed one thing. They missed that Orlando had the hottest season on record. It was 7 degrees warmer than it had been for any Orlando event in the last 15 years, so we ran out of ice cream. Now you laugh, but running out of ice cream is a major catastrophe. It turns out food and beverage is among the most correlated thing with the NPS of an event. And if the NPS of an event goes down, the likelihood that a customer buys from you in the next quarter goes down even faster. So running out of ice cream means that we had a weak quarter if we didn't do something to figure it out. So what have we done? We've now added weather to our models, cold and warm weather. We don't want to run out of cocoa either at a cold weather event. And moving forward, maybe we won't fall prey to that again, but certainly we'll miss something else. Now, I picked events because companies spend so much money on them. They're often the single largest expense in a marketing budget. And as I already said, they often spend more on that than they spend on data science as a discipline. But I want to talk about products as well. Products are the core of what companies do. Whether you're an early stage company, a startup, or a mature company, one of the toughest decisions that you can make is what features and functions should go in your product. Now, if you're a Silicon Valley person, you go, I know what the answer is, it's MPV, right? The minimum viable MVP, the minimal viable product. But who decides what's minimal? And how do you know what's viable? It's a tough question. In the old days, large companies basically decided it based on product managers, experts in that discipline that knew more than anybody else, and they made the decisions inside out. Over the years, we've become more sophisticated. We invite customers to come in and tell us, usually the most strategic and most valuable customers, what would you be willing to pay for? The problem is one individual can't represent the needs of a very large customer. And so techniques have become very much more sophisticated. Now you have online panels and communities. We have one called SAP Idea Place, where every quarter there are tens of thousands of people that put in 20,000+ suggestions and they get voted on by the community. But the reality, as epitomized in this Steve Jobs quote, that by and large, customers don't really know what they want. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. When you build something that a customer asks for, by and large, they don't use it the way that they thought they were going to use it. So in a perfect world, you wouldn't listen to customers. You would watch them. You would see what they do and try to build things that they were trying to solve rather than what they said they were trying to solve. In the advent of cloud software, you can do exactly that. So I want to talk about a little bit of what we do in one of our divisions, a company called Concur. Now, Concur is the world's largest travel and expense software. 40 million users in 100 countries. Odds are at least half the people in this room use Concur to submit their expenses when they come back from this conference. To give you a sense how big it is and how much data we have to mine, last year in 2015, there were 76 billion of transactions that went through the Concur system. That's travel, flights, or rental car. That's lodging, like hotels. That's F&B, food and beverage, as people like to say, like restaurants. So there are tons of things that we can figure out. For example, I can tell you the top 1% of all travelers that's in our 76 billion of data spent 146 flight segments in the air last year. 146 flight segments and 178 days in hotels. That's a road warrior. 178 days in a hotel, on average, the top 1%. I can also tell you that on average, people pay 23 cents per mile for flights. So if you flew here from New York to San Francisco, the average price of your flight should have been $670. I can also tell you there's a segment of very frugal travelers who spend on average 18 cents per mile. It's not because they go different places. It's not because they travel more or less. It's exactly like your travel agent always told you. It's because they buy more than 30 days in advance. That's the secret for saving money on travel. Almost nothing else really works. Based on all this data, we can figure out how to build a better product. For example, in 2015, homestays for business use, for example, Airbnb, but not limited to Airbnb, increased 56% over 2014. Less than I would have guessed, and still only represent less than single-digit percentage of all stays by business travelers. On the other hand, car sharing increased several 100%, car sharing like Lyft or Uber, and now for many companies is more than 25% of how they get around. So if you're going to do an integration, you likely integrate with Lyft and Uber before you integrate with Airbnb. Very simple example. Another more subtle example is 23% of all expense reports are submitted outside of normal business hours. Now, maybe there's no normal business hours, but we call that as 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., which means you can't assume that the traveler is on the business network, and the odds are they're more likely to use a mobile device. Change the way you design the screen. Now I want to give you a very concrete example, and I'm going to do this in the form of a quiz. Of the 76 billion that went through the Concur network, roughly 10 billion of it was for food and beverage. So I want you don't have to say this out loud, but to yourself, to guess what establishment was responsible for the highest fraction of that food and beverage. I'll give you a second to think about it. Of all the 10 billion, 40 million people in 100 countries, what establishment was most responsible for food and beverage? So everyone's got an answer in their head. I tricked you. It's not one of the examples that are on the slide. It's Starbucks. Starbucks is number one in beverage. Starbucks is number one in food. Starbucks is number one in business meetings. Surprising, perhaps, but it's also in the top 5 in something else which is not as good, which is the Concur network has something fun, which is if you use an approved credit card, often a corporate credit card, but can be your personal credit card, those expenses are automatically put on expense report. You don't have to manually enter them. You don't have to save the receipt. It's a fantastic feature which saves me a ton of time. I'm always losing my receipts. But Starbucks is in the bottom 3 of establishments where they use their preferred credit card to get automatically added. Why is that? That seems weird. Well, the intuition of everyone that looked at this data is because, well, Starbucks purchases are relatively small, so obviously people are more using cash than anything else, and cash is not hard. That's not true at all. I see a bunch of you shaking your head. But for many, many quarters, that's what we believed. Until finally somebody ran a bunch of data, interviewed a bunch of Starbucks users, and discovered the answer is the mobile phone. People are more addicted to the loyalty points that they get from Starbucks than the convenience of actually having automatic integration. Now this is a problem, because with loyalty points, that means you don't have integration, which means it takes more time to submit your expense report, which means you lose more expenses, which means you get your money back slower. It's not good for the individual. We also know from other panel studies that when you can't find your receipt, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, you tend to overestimate how much you actually spent. So that means you're getting paid back more than you should. It's a bad thing. So based on that insight, we went to Starbucks, integrated in their mobile app, and now you can pay with their mobile app and not your preferred credit card and still get posted instantly. To be fair, it turns out in 2013, a product manager had proposed this integration. But she was roundly shouted down by executives who thought it was a dumb idea. As it turns out, in 2014, Starbucks had come to us and suggested that we do this. And we said, see our really long backlist of things we have to do? We have 1,000 features to get to. We'll get to you in 2040. It was the data that convinced us that our intuition was probably wrong. So a story about marketing, a story about product, and I want to end with a story about sales. Digital selling has become very popular, particularly in Silicon Valley, but even in large companies. And digital selling challenges all of us as data scientists. We all know that people who get data often make wrong decisions based on that, and we often blame that on confusion between correlation and cause. But I see lots of examples where even the best data scientists misinterpret the data because they don't know what objective they're really trying to solve. So in case you don't know about the new digital selling models, let me just give you a very brief overview. In general, you give a product away for free in hopes at some point in the future they'll pay for it. There are lots of different ways to run this model. One of the more popular ones is called freemium, which is you have a no-cost version forever, and then you upgrade to some new features that have that. I'm going to ignore the freemium model just for simplification here and talk about the trial model, trial to pay. So you don't charge somebody for the full product for, say, the first 30 days, and after the first 30 days, they have to pay to keep using it, or it goes away. Now, one of the most difficult questions, which is, in my opinion, unsolved, is at the time that somebody shows up for the freemium model to get to the trial, do you ask them for their credit card at that moment? Or do you wait for the credit card until after the trial expires when it's time for them to pay? Now, we all have intuition here. We know that if you don't ask for the credit card up front, more people are going to sign up for the trial. On the other hand, if you ask for the credit card up front, you can automatically charge it when the trial ends, and therefore your conversion rate is going to increase. So which is better, a large number of trials or a better conversion rate? What's your intuition say? Well, if you're an early stage startup, actually, I would recommend go for the large number of trials. It's a kind of free branding. It convinces your investors that people care about your product. It doesn't matter that they're never really going to use it. It's a good idea. Sorry if you're a VC and you're in the room, but that's what most early stage companies. But if you're a big company, it's not so obvious. There's a cost for all these free trials. It uses your infrastructure, and they're never really going to convert. So as a data scientist, I would do what you would do. Run an A/B test. See which one works better. So here's an actual real A/B test. 20,000 people enter the landing page. The control is you have to have your credit card. The challenger is no credit card required. 10,000 each bucket. You can see 5 times more people sign up for the trial because they don't have to give the credit card. On the challenger side, that makes sense. If you're a bigger population, when the time comes at the end of 30 days to buy, 6 times as many people end up with the purchased product because of the conversion rate. So based on math, it's better to ask for the credit card up front. You go back to the exec and say, we're going to ask for credit card up front. It's 20% better. And what happens? They say, yeah, I'm not really sure 20% is worth it. What? In every model I've ever built since I was this big, 20% is a huge win. What do you mean it's not worth it? Well, maybe those trial people will come back one day and buy. It's good for us to have a lot of trials. It's good for branding. My gut says it's worth going. Look, that number 2,000 is so much bigger than the number 400. Why wouldn't you do that? It's the law of large numbers, which works really well in big companies. As a data scientist, you then walk out of the room in disgust and say, can't people make decisions based on fact? But in fact, maybe you're asking the wrong question. Most business models now are about subscriptions. The initial sale is less than important than what happens at some future point in time. And for sake of argument, let's say that initial subscription period was only 90 days. I actually find that 90-day subscriptions are better in many cases than 1-year subscriptions, which is the industry standard. What happens when the first renewal happens? Not 30 days when you went from trial to paid, but 90 days after the first paid to the renew. It turns out that if you ask for the credit card up front, they're less likely to renew after the first 90 days. They're more likely to renew if you don't ask for the credit card up front. So in fact, the net situation is it's slightly more advantageous to not ask for the credit card up front, and that the gut decision might have actually been better. Darn it. Why is that so, though? As a data scientist, I hate when someone's gut overwhelms my fact-based discussion. The answer to this problem is multifold. And again, time doesn't permit for me to go through all of it. But in general, the answer is to segment your trial users. And if you segment your trial users based on their demographics, who they are, what company they work for, and how they use the product during the trial, you'll discover the thing that's most correlated with later purchase is how they use the product during the trial. Not what company they work for, not who they are individually, but just what they do. And by and large, you'll find that they in 3 categories. What we call one and done. People get the trial, play with it for 1 day, not 2 days, 1 day, and then essentially never use it again. You might imagine that they rarely, if ever, buy. And when you remove the gate, when you don't ask for the credit card up front, you get many more of the one and dones, people that are never going to buy. On the other end of the spectrum are what we call the true evaluators. People that really seem to have a business problem they want solved. They use the product in spurts, not every day, but in intensive. They explore almost all the features. And it turns out that removing the credit card gate, the challenger, doesn't really increase the number of them. There's a few more of those, but not many. And it doesn't change their conversion rate. They've got a business problem to solve. They really are interested in deciding to buy. They don't care whether you ask for a credit card up front or not. The interesting bit is the people in the middle, the infrequent users. Though they explore for a couple of hours, go away, come back, explore for more couple of hours, go away, and come back again. I'm getting the hook that I'm almost done here.
Leave time for questions, 1 minute. And people are still asking you move the mic closer to your mouth.
So I will hold it then. So they, as it turns out, are less likely to renew when it's time to renewal, but more likely to purchase. Why? They feel like they were tricked. And so for them, you want to ask permission. And more importantly, you don't just want to ask permission, you actually want the credit card authorization to be done in the product, in-app selling, rather than on a website. Because when they can control the time when they make the product, then they're the most valuable. So the end of the story is, don't put in a gate to make your executives happy in the law of large numbers. Ignore the one and done people entirely. Spend all your energy not on the true evaluators, but on the infrequent users, and make their life easy. That is the cultural change. Since I only have 1 minute, I'll end with a general thought, which is over the years, I've learned that it doesn't matter how good your algorithm is. It doesn't matter how good your data model is. None of that matters if it doesn't get implemented. The lift of a good model that never goes in production is 0. And the reality is, executives are still making their decisions based on their gut. So that's why I've changed and spent less time now on technology, less time on data, and more time on culture. That's why I've recognized that to really make data science what it needs to be, all of us need to step back from the algorithms from time to time, ask ourselves what must be true in order to get this model into production, figure out what the cultural rejection for that might be, and learn how to overcome those objections. Because models are powerful, but culture is even more powerful. Yes, cultural eats data science for breakfast. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that talk. That was quite enlightening. Just quick comment on your culture eats, I guess, data. Aren't you just not shifting your focus and looking at different features as opposed to, because culture for me is also made up of data, right? So there's just a quick comment there. Then the bigger question was, you've looked at a lot of data. Have you seen transitioning of data models into heuristics, which I would call gut feeling?
Yeah, so first point I'll make is the reality is executives are less reliable than data. Meaning, depending on what happened to them the previous day or even in the previous meeting, they might change their opinion based on the same set of facts. So it's much harder to build models to change culture. It can be done, but it's much harder. To your second point, unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion that a less accurate model, which is easier to explain, is more likely to be implemented than a higher accurate model, which is harder to explain. So I spend less of my energy on chasing the last 1, 2, 3% of accuracy and more on approximation, as you called them, heuristics, which I can convince people to believe in and therefore get into production.
I had a comment about the culture eats data science for breakfast. One or two examples that you cited, like the one on the subscription model, it seems to me that the initial question may not have been correct, or there was something within the business judgment or gut that might be missing, because eventually you got out to what the executive thought was the case when you expanded the time series and basically look at maybe a year and see that those recurring subscribers were pulling out. So I was wondering whether it's a case of whether or not we should be thinking more about the questions more carefully rather than the algorithms, and maybe we can still go out toe-to-toe culture, but doesn't necessarily need to be a loss.
So I agree with you, and I think you've made my point for me, which is by and large, we tend to build models that we're asked to build. Figure out how to increase the try to paid conversion rate. Figure out how to get more people to sign up for trials. Those are the problems we get. And maybe we need to spend more time, rather than solving those problems, is reformulating them, as you suggested, to a different problem. But if you go live in Silicon Valley, it's always the front end of the funnel. So think about a different problem. I agree, that's a cultural issue.
Okay,
One last quick question.
Okay,
It's not quick, stop it.
fair enough. Straight back, yes. That's you, yeah, in the dress, yeah.
So I have gone all over the place. I've worked in IT, design, on-site, et cetera, right? And so when you were talking about the credit card thing, that is a well-known dark pattern in design, and it's researched and known. And so if you had a designer who had a strong background, they could have said that from the beginning.
Turns out we had one of the world's strongest designers on our team. But we're dealing with a different audience than the traditional audience that's been used to solve this problem. So I'm happy to talk to you in more detail after this. It's, again, his intuition, his background turned out to be wrong in our situation.
Please join me in thanking Jonathan for an amazing